Good evening. It's 6 o'clock on Tuesday, July 19th, 2016. Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight for the English edition of Aura News, where we bring you today's top stories translated into English every weeknight. Assembly Speaker Ilir Mehta held a meeting with Democratic Party Chairman Lulzam Basha and expressed optimism for the adoption of the reform. After the meeting, the Assembly Speaker gave assurance that the July 21st plenary session will not close until the judicial reform is adopted. The judicial reform will be adopted. There is only one plan, the adoption of reform with consensus, according to Venice Commission. We are close to reaching an agreement. I want to assure Brussels and Washington that despite the rhetoric, the Republic of Albania will take this major and historic step to strengthen the rule of law in the fight against crime and corruption. Two issues of disagreement will be solved, and no one should think of undermining consensus. Mr. Basha promised me that the opposition's vote will be in favor of the reform. Public poisonous rhetoric is hampering consensus. I want to request that the local and foreign stakeholders focus on the issues and on Venice, declared the Assembly Speaker. The DP chairman also gave assurance that the opposition will vote in favor of the reform in principle and accused the Prime Minister of making efforts to destroy consensus during negotiations. The Democratic Party is ready to vote on the reform with consensus. Yesterday, the parties reached an agreement for the constitutional draft. When the agreement was written and everything was being prepared to be signed, the most absurd thing happened, and the agreement over two issues related to the International's role was broken. This is an ominous effort to destroy consensus. Rama did this to stop the Democratic Party from joining its votes for a consensual project. The DP is ready to vote on the draft in principle. If consensus is not reached today over the two issues of disagreement, I proposed that Mehta goes to Brussels and resolves the issue, declared the DP chairman, adding that the Prime Minister wants to reject the reform by using the opposition. After the meeting, the DP chairman invited journalists to the Democratic Party headquarters, where he informed them about the two remaining issues that are keeping the parties divided. It was proposed that the Internationals would have the right to exclude candidates from application without providing facts. This is against the Constitution. The second point is related to the way the International Observing Mission operates in Albania. The proposal for Article 123 was unexpectedly rejected with the claim that missions which function under an agreement cannot be contested in the Constitutional Court, explained the DP chairman. Meanwhile, the Assembly Speaker declared during an unexpected press conference that Thursday's plenary session agenda had been adopted and the draft amendments are on it. Mr. Mehta appealed for negotiations to be open to the media. He asked for a moratorium of political statements. Populism has damaged the reform. It's time for transparency, said Mehta. Prime Minister Edi Rama expressed his willingness to negotiate, if necessary, until the last minute for the judicial reform in order to finalize it along with consensus, along with the opposition. The Prime Minister asked the opposition to negotiate and find consensus and gave assurances that the Alliance for a European Albania will vote in favor of the reform. The Prime Minister called on the opposition MPs to let their conscience listen to the Albanian people's request for an independent justice. Almost at the end of this journey of negotiations and agreement for the judicial reform, the Prime Minister admitted the Democrats' contribution. In this difficult process, the Democratic Party has won what it has deserved, and I want to sincerely compliment Mr. Basha and his team for the results they have achieved, said the Prime Minister. Earlier this day, the Prime Minister held a meeting with the Party for Justice, Integrity and Unity's chairman. After the meeting, the Prime Minister did not comment on the meeting, but the PJIU party chairman declared that his party members will not give their votes in favor of the reform if there is no consensus, and that a referendum will be asked for. U.S. Ambassador Donald Lu continues with his efforts towards the judicial reform. The ambassador joined a civil society protest today, which was held outside the Assembly building. He issued a strong statement to the Albanian politicians who might vote against the reform, warning them of specific and long-term sanctions against them. sanctions which, according to him, have been issued by Washington. There will be specific negative consequences from the United States for those political leaders who vote against the reform. I have submitted the specific consequential details according to Washington's clear-cut guidelines to the parties. I can assure you that there will be definite and long-term consequences, declared Ambassador Liu. The U.S. ambassador issued some critiques about the DP chairman's stance on the judicial reform. 2 weeks ago, I heard that if Basha and Bulik-Bashi's disagreement over Venice Recommendation 88 was solved, they were ready to vote on the reform. We solved this issue on June 9th. Prime Minister Rama offered them exactly what Basha had asked for, but then it was not enough. Now, for the first time, they are saying they cannot accept the internationals making evaluations and classifications of commissioners because of national sovereignty. This seems bizarre, as May 19th, Basha told me and the EU ambassador that the internationals are the only ones who can clean the fish from the head. He said the same thing to members of the European Parliament, Kukan and Fleckenstein. Now the DP has unexpectedly changed their stance. Powerful people are afraid. Citizens are asking for a change. It's time to make a decision, said the U.S. ambassador, who deems the judicial reform as a second independence and used the Declaration of Independence by Ismail Chamali as an example. Albania was founded approximately 100 years ago by some brave men and women, men like Ismail Chamali, who risked their lives for this country's independence. It is again the time to have to ask Albanians to have the courage and confidence to do what is right. The time to decide is now. Adopt the reform, declared Ambassador Liu. The civil society will also protest on Wednesday and Thursday outside the Albanian parliament. The EU Commissioner for Enlargement, Johannes Hahn, proposed that if the judicial reform fails to be adopted, the country should go for a referendum. He also noted that this option can postpone the accession of negotiations with the EU by a year and a half. During his speech at the European Parliament's Foreign Issues Committee, Hahn urged the Albanian politicians to respect the people's will, as 91% of citizens are in favor of judicial reform's adoption. There is a deadline for the adoption of this reform, which is Thursday of this week. A decision should be made within this time. I have to say that if there is no agreement in Parliament, there is the possibility of holding a referendum, as more than 90% of Albanian citizens are in favor of adopting the reform. However, this alternative will postpone the accession of negotiations by at least 1 year. Furthermore, Hahn stressed that the EU would prefer that the reform be adopted with consensus on Thursday in Parliament. He added that the process should be transparent and that leaders should be open with citizens to increase reliability in their ranks. In closing, Hahn emphasized that failure to adopt the judicial reform could undermine the country's sustainability in the process of membership in the European Union. Chairman of the committee, Elmar Brok, also said it is very important that adoption of this reform be made with consensus and dialogue between the main political actors. Meanwhile, MEP Tanja Fajon said she has followed the path of reform closely, that the EU is ready to help, but progress must come from the local politicians. Only 48 hours away from voting for the judicial reform in Parliament, the civil society reps have intensified their pressure on the political factor for its adoption. The civil society asked for a meeting of the National Council of Integration, where the EU ambassador, Romana Vlahutin, expressed her confidence that the political class will pass the judicial reform. I believe the reform will be adopted on July 21st. You should represent your citizens with dignity. July 22nd should be the first day of a new battle. Implementation of the reform will require patience and effort. After 2 years of work, the international's role is being touted as a problem. Up until now, political parties have told us there is a lack of trust in the judiciary and requested major intervention from the internationals. In response, the international community, refusing an executive role, proposed an international observing mission. The IOM's rights would be an attachment to the Constitution. All parties agreed with this until 2 weeks ago. We are united in reform, and we do not want to violate national sovereignty. Our joint work is to assist in separating powers and removing politics from the judiciary, said Vlahutin. The chairman of the National Council of Integration declared that no one should kill the reform, while the Minister of Integration gave emphasis for a reform with consensus. Meanwhile, civil society reps continued their pleas for adopting the judicial reform with consensus, as 90% of Albanian people want the reform. That's all for our English edition this evening. Please join us again Monday through Saturday at 6 p.m. for your local news in English. My name is Mari, and on behalf of Aura News, thank you and good night.